All right, hi everyone. This is chapter 37, Plant Sensory Systems, Signals, and Responses. This is a pretty cool chapter because you don't normally think of plants as having a sensory system or responding to something or really signaling to other plants. So we're going to look at the ways in which this happens and look at how hormones move through plants and how cells communicate with each other through various pathways in one plant and actually from plant to plant, which is kind of interesting. So plants receive and must respond to a whole lot of environmental stimuli. So think about things that change in the environment: temperature, amount of precipitation, light availability, nutrient availability. All these things are going to have to be addressed by a plant in some way. So they can sense and respond to information about lots of these things. Pressure in wounds, kind of interesting, because pressure being, if something's pulling on a plant, or if a plant is injured in some way, if it's, cut or something like that. Plants have something of the equivalent of a sense of smell and can perceive certain airborne molecules, so they can take those in and respond accordingly in a similar way to our olfactory system. Plants do have a sense of taste as well, because their roots can detect nutrients in the soil. So really interesting the way these work. And the transduction pathways of these molecules getting into the cells are actually similar to what we see in animals. So this process of taking in information and integrating it and then ultimately putting a response occurs in 3 steps. So sensory cells have to receive an external signal. Okay, so sunlight, let's say, can be an external signal. That sunlight has to hit the plant, and then the plant has to make sense of it and turn it into an intracellular signal so that it can now send this signal to other parts of the plant body, and that's going to be done in the form of hormones, plant hormones. So the sensory cells are going to send that signal to target cells via hormones, other parts of the plant's body. So, okay, the sunlight's coming in. Let's turn ever so slightly towards the sunlight. Okay, and that's step 3. Target cells receiving the signal, changing their activity to produce an appropriate response. So here's a look at this step, the steps here in information processing. So the first step here, the sensory cell, generally, on the outer portion of the plant, here on the leaf it's being shown, and this signal is going to be sent to the plant cell, and then within the plant cell, all right, this stimulus is going to be transduced into an internal signal, and ultimately that signal is going to be sent to various cells, okay? And from there, they're going to elicit a response to send the signal even further down. So here's our external stimulus, your internal signal, your cell-to-cell signal, and then ultimately hormones are going to take it down via internal signals to the target cells that will initiate some sort of change. In this case, it appears as though this plant is turning to the right here, possibly towards a stimulus. So a little bit about what's happening here at the cellular level. So when a stimulus is received by the sensory cell, the information is changed into a form that is meaningful to the cell. And this is going to happen by way of receptors in the cell membrane. So proteins that are embedded in the cell's membrane are called signal receptors. And what these do is when the stimulus comes in, they're going to change shape in response to that stimulus. So what are some things that could be stimuli? Different wavelengths of light, application of pressure, binding a particular type of molecule. So let's say a molecule comes in, it binds to that signal receptor. Now that's going to elicit a response in the cell via a whole bunch of chemical pathways. Okay. So that conformational change that takes place changes this external signal into an intracellular signal. Okay, and that's going to get the cell ready to then do what it is that it's going to do. So this is all happening in those cells, right here in the leaf. But how do we get the message down here? That's going to be done with the help of hormones. So the hormones transport to the target cells where then a physiological response takes place. And the same thing happens in the human body as well. You have hormones that are produced in your pituitary gland, which is up, under your brain, and the pituitary gland is going to stimulate hormones all throughout the body to cause growth and various other changes. So those hormones are traveling long distances. The same thing's happening in a plant. So anytime you think of a kind of a slower response and a physiological change that's happening downstream, it's going to be a hormone. So plants don't have a nervous system the way we do, so we can very quickly transmit messages throughout the body. But this hormone pathway is very slow, so that's why you wouldn't see necessarily, for most types of plants, them moving. There are some where you can, and I'll talk about an example in a bit, but for the most part, these changes happen very slowly. So how do hormones move around the plant? So they can go through transport proteins in the cell membrane, through the gap junctions, the plasmodesmata. They can move through the xylem and the phloem. Talked about those already. They can move down their concentration gradients from a high concentration of the hormone to a low concentration via diffusion. And plants can actually receive several hormones at once. And just like in the human body or in animals, hormones will affect each other and interact and modulate the cell's response. So you can end up with a great degree of an action or a very small degree of an action, depending on how many hormones are binding to receptors and are released. So hormones have various ways of doing that. There's upregulation and downregulation. We're not really going to get into that too much in this course. I think maybe later on in the semester we do talk about the endocrine system, but for now we won't. So these signaling molecules, these hormones, only will elicit a response if a cell has a receptor for that specific hormone. So some signal receptors exist inside a cell where they respond to signaling molecules that can diffuse through the cell membrane. So those would be like located in the nucleus or something like that, but most of them are actually located on the outside of the cell membrane, where they respond to external stimuli or bind to signaling molecules that do not cross the membrane. And that process there, where we've got this hormone binding to a receptor on the cell membrane and then ultimately causing a reaction in the cell, that process is called signal transduction, and it involves various secondary messengers after the binding of the hormone to the plasma membrane. So once the receptor protein receives the hormones, two major things, like I said, are going to happen here. So the first thing is a cascade of reactions called a phosphorylation cascade. So the receptor protein changes shape, and in the process of changing shapes, ATP is produced. Okay, from a phosphate is donated to that ATP to produce it. From there, secondary messengers like cyclic AMP are produced that are going to trigger a whole bunch of intracellular signals. This is all happening inside of one cell. So again, keeping the big picture in mind, what's happening here? A hormone that was released up in, like, let's say the leaves has now come down. It's now bind to a receptor on a cell down in the stem of a plant. Okay, we want the plant to move. So when that hormone binds to the receptor, it's going to signal this phosphorylation cascade, signal these secondary messengers to ultimately elicit the response that the plant needs. So it's just a translation of the message. So phosphorylation cascades, second messengers may interact to modify the cell response. So for example, secondary messengers can activate phosphorylation cascades in some signal transduction pathways. So that means that this process of, producing more ATP can continue, okay, and they can kind of build off of each other. Activation of a signal transduction pathway results in the production of many phosphorylated proteins, okay, with phosphate groups attached, or the release of many second messengers, amplifying the original signal many times. So again, that's that cascade of reactions where, depending on the needs of this plant, we can see multiple secondary messengers, we can see multiple phosphorylation cascades taking place to amplify the original stimulus. Okay? So here's a great figure that kind of shows you, an example of this happening. So in step one, you can see the signal arrives at the top in signal transduction. So that signal can be, again, the hormone. It can be any sort of stimulus that we're discussing. The second step, which is going to involve the phosphorylation cascade, the receptor protein is going to change in response to that signal. All right, so it makes a conformational change. In the process of making that conformational change, what happens is we see the phosphorylation of ATP to ADP. Lots and lots of reactions. You don't really need to know this, but just know that these reactions trigger a secondary messenger. Okay, secondary messenger is going to ultimately initiate a response, whether it's a change in the ion flows, change in transcription, change in the process of translation, right? It's going to do something to this cell to change how it functions. So here is that response. So the response to signal binding with a receptor can result in the activation of membrane proteins, producing a change in the electrical potential, which can ultimately lead to changes in how the cell functions, changes in gene expression, new proteins or RNAs. Okay, when cells respond to a signal, this change in activity helps the plant cope with whatever issue is being sensed. So in this case, it could be an environmental change. Whatever it is going to help the plant cope. So it's really a response to a stimuli, getting the plant to some better state. So here's an example of one of these cases where a plant is going to respond to a stimuli. In the case of light, it's called phototropism. So in phototropism, what's happening is the plant is actually moving and bending towards the light. So experiment that was done by Charles Darwin, what we see here is that the plant is actually bending towards the light. So we wanted to know, okay, how is this happening? Where are the receptors for this? So a couple of different experimental setups. So in one case, the tip was removed, and when the tip was removed, there was no movement. Okay? But we knew the bending was happening down here. So let's cover the top and see what happens. Same thing, no bending. Let's leave the tip open, but cover the bottom. And we see the plant still bends. So that tells us that the light responsible for triggering phototropism is sensed at the tip of this plant. So here is where the stimulus is received and the cell-to-cell interaction takes place, and the hormones are transported down here where the signal transduction cascade takes place, and that's what causes the plant to bend. Okay? So here's again that interpretation. So that's phototropism, moving in response to light. Moving in response to gravity is called gravitotropism, and in this case, the roots are going to respond to gravity by growing down, and the shoots respond to gravity by growing up. Okay, so the ends of the root tips have a protective root cap, and in the same experiment, the Darwins found that roots stops responding to gravity if the root cap is removed. So that tells us that in the root cap, there are cells that contain starch granules, and these are going to sense gravity, and they're found at the center of the root cap. So that, tells these roots to grow downward. Okay, and you can see these cells are going to essentially sense gravity and tell the roots where to go. So think about it. How do they know to grow down? Why aren't they growing upwards? Okay, they're growing downwards because these they're sensing gravity. Same thing with the shoots. The shoots, why are they growing up? Why are they not growing down? Right? They're sensing gravity and they're going against it. So very amazing the way these things work. Another tropism, thigmotropism. This is a plant's movement in response to touch. So this can actually be a rapid movement, one of the few examples, but it takes a lot of energy. So you may have seen plants that kind of curl around something. The tendrils make contact with an object and wrap around the item one or more times per hour. You've probably seen a Venus flytrap, and I'll see if I can find a video, I think I have one, of Venus flytrap closing quickly. And it's the same kind of thing. The plant is responding to touch. So the fly is coming, it's landing on the Venus flytrap, and it's essentially closing in like a trap door. But it takes a lot of energy. There has to be a fly in there for it to be worth it for the Venus flytrap to close. So if you've ever purchased a little Venus flytrap as a plant to have in your house and you start sticking things in there to get it to close, you're going to kill it because it needs to, clamp down on an insect, or that mechanism for closing it is not worth the trouble. There's also some plants, too, that you can actually touch them. They're like little weeds, and they'll curl up on each other. You may have seen those as well. Okay, so here's the tendrils of the plant curling around, right? This is, in response to the environment. And these are all examples of thigmotropism. Okay, so what are some of the hormones that are involved in plant growth and aging and maturity? You don't think about plants as aging, but they do, right? They go through life cycles just like we do. So some of the major hormones in plants, and I think there's a slide coming up that explains them, are the auxins, cytokinins, gibberellins, and ABA, Brassina steroids, and ethylene. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of these, but there's a good activity that if we were in in-person class, I'd have you guys kind of do in groups that takes you through how all of these work. But for now, just take a look at the plant hormones and recognize them and kind of what they do. The one that I tend to kind of talk about a lot is ethylene because we see this one most commonly. It's what causes the ripening of fruits. So that ethylene is going to do that. Kind of acts in opposition to auxin, which is going to be when a plant is growing. So it's kind of dying once the ethylene is produced. And certain things will speed up the production of ethylene, like leaving fruit out will speed that up. Your banana is going to get brown, whereas if you put it in your refrigerator, it's going to stay, the ethylene is going to stay at bay for a little bit longer. So kind of getting on that, ethylene and senescence, the regulated process of aging and death, triggered by hormones. So ethylene is going to be, like I said, strongly associated with fruit ripening, flower fading, and leaf abscission. So it influences plant growth and is a stress hormone that is induced by drought. So that is, what we see coming out when a plant is dying. Okay. So there it is in green, the flowers, and then, or the flowers, the bananas, and the ethylene. Once it starts to produce, the bananas start to ripen, they become yellow, and then ultimately brown as they senescence. All right. And here's a look at the levels of auxin, which I said kind of go opposite to what's going on with the ethylene. So in high auxin, the healthy leaf's got lots of capability to take in oxygen or take in CO2, let out oxygen, do all of its leaf functions normally. As we start to get into autumn, leaf senescence begins, and we start to see the ethylene taking over. We start to see the chlorophyll pigments breaking down, and the leaf becomes much lower in auxin until it's essentially detaching in the winter time. Okay. So that will end this chapter, and I hope you learned something about how leaves die. And I'll see you next time.